Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here for IQ&A episode 3. We are incredibly honored tonight to be joined by our special guest. I can honestly say that without him we wouldn't have IQ&A, and I can honestly say that we wouldn't even have Icarus because this is the man whose music brought us together as a group. He is a living legend, and although he's retired, he's still writing music, and his whole output is really astounding. So we're really looking forward to asking him questions tonight and talking about our experience playing his music, and we hope you enjoy this conversation. So thank you. This is Paul Lansky, and thank you so much for being here with us, Paul. So the music that you just heard was Paul's piece, Tables Clear, which was written quite a while ago now, but it is from a period of time when you were writing strictly electronic music. Is that right?
Yeah, this I made this in 1989 or 90. I can't remember. It was after I came back from California. I was teaching at Cal Arts for a semester, and this was me with my two boys, aged 9 and 14 at the time. They're now 39 and 44. So this must have been 1990. And we just sort of started to bang on pots and pans in the kitchen after dinner, and I got the idea of recording it and making a piece out of it. So we banged on everything available, and I recorded it all on my Sony Walkman. And my younger son gave me some armpit parts and some belches, and my older son gave me some plucks from his violin. And so this is just all available noises, and it was great fun to do. It's sort of the scenario for the piece is sort of starts out as if it's a real experience. Somebody's just banging on something, and it has the rhythm of somebody just sort of casually doing something, and it becomes more and more rhythmic and more dreamlike, and finally it goes into a sort of fantastic swirl, and after 20 minutes it sort of dissolves, and if you listen carefully you can hear me saying, I think we'd better help Mom clean up now. So, and that's the end of the piece. But this piece got me into writing percussion music because percussionists asked me for the score, and I had no score of it. It was all done on the computer using algorithmic composition. So there's a lot of random number choices in there to sort of get a complicated rhythm. There was one group who did some sort of transcription of it, but it wasn't very good, and I prefer to leave it as it is. But so production asked me for the score, and I said, well, why don't I just write a new one? And so that's how I started, and that's how Threads came about. It was in 2024 or 25.
Yeah, I had no idea that's how Threads came about. So they asked you for the score to Tables Clear, and then you said, why don't I just write you something else, like a new piece for it?
Yeah, that's my memory of it. It's a long time ago, but that's basically what happened, I think. So they were great. They said, well, I remember talking with them outside a dance concert where they were playing, and they said, why don't you write a piece for us? And I hadn't ever written for percussion, and I said that to them, and they said, well, you actually have written a lot of percussion music, so a lot of your electronic pieces are percussion pieces. And I said, well, what do? You put these little black dots on this funny looking staff? and they said, well, they were great. They said, well, why don't you write some stuff and bring it to our studio and we'll play it for you? So I actually wrote a set of studies. I think I wrote 13 studies, and I went to their Box Street studio and they played it for me, and they gave me clues about what was cliche and what was not, and that turned into threads.
Awesome. How about we backtrack a little bit, just so we go in some kind of chronological order, because we just listened to Tables, and we'll definitely go to how all of your electronic and computer music to influence your instrumental and human music. But we were hoping to talk a little bit, about the music that you wrote for most of your life. So, I'm sure all of you know that Paul's earlier works were with computer and with tape. Can you talk maybe a little bit about what it was like writing that kind of stuff at that time? Because that was the rage back then.
Well, talking about a long period of time, I basically started writing computer music in 1966, and that was before you were born. And it was on a mainframe at Princeton, and it was impossibly hard. When I started to work on it, in order to hear anything, I had to have a digital tape written and call Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, which is 40 miles north of Princeton, and arrange to take the tape up, the digital tape up, to have it converted to sound. And it was a dreadful trip, and I used to console myself with an ice cream on the way back. And I dropped it until 1973, when one of my students, a guy named Barry Berko, had come to Princeton, and he wrote a program called Music 360, which was a little easier to use. And so in 1973, I decided to try again, and I wrote Mild and Liza, which is based on the Tristan chord. So the whole piece is based on a minor third and a minor third and a major third separated by a minor third, or a minor third and a major third and a minor third separated by a minor third. That's the dominant seventh chord, and then different combinations of that. And the piece won a competition from the ISCM, and it came out on an LP on Columbia Records. And I sort of hoped the piece would die a quiet death. It was my first computer piece, and I was proud of it when I did it, but it got boring pretty fast. And then Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead found the LP in a record shop when they were on their OK Computer tour of the United States, and he made an improv tape, which he gave to Tom York, and Tom York wrote a piece called Idiotech based on it. And the story that Johnny told me was that after he gave Tom this improv tape, Tom said, who wrote that, where'd you get that chord sequence? And I think Johnny said something like, oh shit, I think I know where that comes from. So I got a very nice email from Johnny Greenwood saying, we don't usually take things without asking, so we're asking for your permission. And of course I gave him my permission. And the rest is history. My enrollments when Kid A came out, this was 2000, I think. And my name was associated with it. My enrollments at Princeton doubled. So it was was a fun experience. I got free tickets to Radiohead concerts, and got to meet the band. So I actually like their piece better than the original Milton Liza was 19 minutes long.
That's really incredible. Yeah, I remember, going through college, and I had already been playing your music. I had already been a huge fan of your work, and that was around the same time that Radiohead was becoming my favorite band. And when I went to the So Percussion Summer Institute, I think it was 2010, I believe, and that's where I found out that was your sample in Idiotech, and the fact that those were merging was pretty crazy for me. So it brought both of you guys to a whole nother status in my book. For those of you who may not know the song, we have a clip of this, and you can hear the chord progression that's used, that's sampled from the beginning of Paul's work, Mild and Lisa. Is that how you pronounce it?
Milton Liza.
Milton Liza, thank you. Okay. So here is...
That's from Princeton, where it's all the same. Milton Liza, be ever helped.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, well, here is some of Radiohead's Idiotech. One of my favorite songs. I think it's on my record player as we speak.
Yeah, Tom York did an interview with Terry Gross on the Philadelphia station, WHYY, and he talked about the tapes that Johnny Greenwood gave him, and he said he listened to it and there were 40 seconds of sheer genius on it, and I was very flattered.
That is high praise.
We actually had a
go ahead.
We had a question come in the stream. This comes from Percussion EDU. That's wondering if you have ever had your music sampled by any other major artists other than Radiohead.
I don't think so. There's one guy who does. I can't remember what his name is. He took one of my Campion fantasies and did a piece with it, and I just found out about it by accident, and I got in touch with him, and he said, "Whoops." So I actually like what he did. So I think there are a couple, but not many.
That's interesting. Yeah, I would have thought after Radiohead did that everyone would have been chomping at the bit to try to do the same thing with your music, because so much of it, I think, could work well in that way. And especially you have all this electronic music that's really rhythmically driven, and I just feel like so much of that could lend itself to that idiom. And so I'm actually surprised that other people haven't done that yet. But I guess it's not too late. So pop stars out there, rock stars. Check out Paul Lansky.
I guess the result as you're enrollment doubling at Princeton could arguably be more important, because your department has produced some of today's kind of brightest stars in the contemporary composition world. And you are now, your title is Emeritus now at Princeton, is that right?
That's correct.
And I think that that program is kind of always in the sentence of who's hot right now in contemporary music, and the program is constantly full of amazing people with amazing voices, and I'm sure that milestone was a big part of kind of setting on that trajectory to where it is now.
Yeah, I was chair for 10 years, and I thought it would ruin my life, but it was actually a life-enhancing experience. I enjoyed it. I supervised the construction of a new renovation to the music building, and that was interesting. We hired some good people, Steve Mackey and Dan Truman and a bunch of other people, and it was good. I was glad I did it. I was glad to end it in 2000, but it was fun while I did it.
That's great. Well, we definitely want to get to some of the music that we play and that we want to talk to you about, and other people we know enjoy playing your music as well. So maybe we can talk a little bit about your transition to electronic music. One of our Instagram followers, Ian Houston, asked how your methods in electronic composition work into your instrumental works. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that switch and how you took your experiences to lend themselves to your new medium.
Well, it happened around 2004. I was starting some new electronic pieces, and I found myself recycling old ideas and old work, and I turned 60 in 2004, and it just seemed to me that this was not a good way to move on. So I had been writing occasional acoustic pieces in the 90s. I wrote a quintet. I wrote some solo marimba pieces. I have a piece called Three Moves for Marimba, which you may have played. It's played a lot. It's sort of it's a deadly piece. You die or manage to play it. So there's some really terrific videos of it on YouTube. It was written for Nancy Zeltzman, who was married to Steve Mackey and living in Princeton at the time, and I'd write stuff and take it over to her. But that was basically it for the 90s. Then in 2004, I wrote a horn trio for horn, violin, and piano for Bill Purvis and Mihai Lee and Curtis McCumber. And that was a great experience. Actually, the horn was my instrument. I played horn when I was in high school, and I had planned to go on for a career as a horn player. And I went to Aspen, and I played in the Aspen Festival Orchestra, and the horn got old, and so writing a horn trio was a formative experience, and I wrote a trio called Etudes and Parodies, which I think was a successful piece, and it was a lot of fun. But the basic issue was that I really liked working with sound, so I sort of regarded myself as a sound sculptor, and writing computer music was a great experience. It was sort of like being in a workshop. When I was a kid, I went to a camp, a so-called work camp, and I was a pottery major. I sort of worked in the pottery shop, and I really enjoyed making things. And that was my experience with computer music. the experience of making something on your own in a studio and coming out with a finished product under your arm. And so that sort of kept me going. It was also a ticket to freedom because I could write, anything I wanted. I didn't have to pass by the thought police. So it had sort of built-in respectability, and that sort of came out when I did a piece called Idle Chatter that was 1984. It was my first explicitly tonal piece, and the reason it was tonal was because I had this very complicated texture, and if I was using a complicated chord structure, it just sounded like garbage. And so I finally just ended with chattering on an F, and I thought, well, what comes best after an F? And I thought, well, what about a D? And let's see, let's add a B flat to that. And I ended up with a B flat chord, and I had this very thick and complicated random texture, and that led to Idle Chatter. And I sort of had built-in respectability because it was not on the computer. If I had tried to do it with Woodwind Trio, at that point in '84, I would have been laughed off the stage. But the computer sort of brought me with a ticket to freedom. I could do anything I wanted, really, and it sort of had an automatic respectability. So I really enjoyed writing computer music. But as I said, around 2004, I started to work up another project, and I found myself recycling what I had done before. It was just more of the same. And I thought, life is short, why not try something new? So I started to write instrumental music, and I was very lucky. I also hated writing scores. I wrote, I used some of the early notation programs, a program called Nightingale, and I used a program called Professional Composer, and that sort of made life easier. It still had the experience of working in the studio and coming out with a finished product. So, at around 2004, I basically stopped doing computer music, and it was very hard to, it's now if I look back on what I was doing at that point, I'd have trouble reconstructing it. I still have all my files, but I had a routine, and it was really complicated routine, and it was hard to reconstruct. So I used a program called Super Collider. I actually wrote my own software. I discovered that I had a knack for writing software. I wrote a program called CMix, and this is still in use. And I switched to a program called Super Collider, which is an object-oriented program. And I had a lot of fun doing that, but it got old, and writing acoustic music was fun, and I had great luck with it. Writing percussion music was really a critical factor, and I have to thank the guys in Soul Percussion for getting me involved in that. So I've been doing that since then, and it's gratifying. So it's all new to me too. I can't foresee it getting old. I'm getting old, but I don't think that writing acoustic music is getting old.
I found it interesting. You said a minute or two ago. You used the word structure music or construct music. You use these kind of verbs. And I read your biography before this, and I didn't know. So your father was a sound engineer. Do you think that maybe sort of influenced the way you think of composition and music?
I don't think so. He was a recording engineer, and he got into that after he came back from the war. He went to RCA school and learned recording techniques. He then got a job at Capitol Records, and he worked at Capitol Records until they closed the New York studio. I guess that was around 1960 something, 69, 70. But he was both my parents were very supportive of my doing music. So my father was a singer in the 40s, in the 30s. He sang with the Schola Cantorum and actually did the Verdi Requiem he sang the chorus of the Verdi Requiem with Toscanini. So I got a lot of support. So I was very lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
Well, that's wonderful. So Paul, I wanted to ask a little bit about your time working with Milton Babbitt and whether or not that had some kind of formative effect on your work with computer music.
Well, Milton, studying composition at Princeton was, I was a bad student. I didn't really listen to what my teachers said, and they were hands-off types. So they were. I remember I worked with Milton for a year in 66, 67 when I was trying to do my first computer piece, and Milton had terrific ears. So I'd play, and he'd say that G sharp up in the upper register is not right. So, but he never really told me what to do. And composition at Princeton wasn't taught in the sort of traditional studio method. You didn't regard yourself as the main pupil of somebody. It was more or less a conversation, and so I had a lot of freedom. But Milton was very patient and respectful, and he didn't impose his views. He just sort of encouraged me and was generally supportive.
I feel like Milton Babbitt is an interesting figure to bring up because the next thing that we kind of wanted to ask you about, and you touched on this a little bit already when you were building that chord, and then you end up with a B flat major chord, and you're saying that if you would have written that for some sort of acoustic ensemble, you would have been laughed off the stage. But because you were writing for a computer, that kind of lent those tonal figures a cutting edge in some way. And so I think that a lot of your music, you can hear these tonal tendencies in there, or at least these very like sonically pleasing tendencies. And this is, I can tell, like a very clear departation from what some of your contemporaries were doing and some of your teachers were doing. And I wonder if you could talk about that choice and if that kind of developed in your music, or when was that a choice of, you know what, I'm going to write tonal music and I don't care what people have to say about it.
Well, it was an interesting moment. I had been writing pieces that had tonal orientation for a long time. The first piece that I wrote that I really considered worth keeping was the Six Fantasies on a Poem by Thomas Campion, which I wrote in 1978, 79. And there's a lot of stuff in there that's tonal. If I look back on it in retrospect, I think that what I was responding to was my hearing, which basically was diatonic rather than chromatic. I still think to this day when I hear complicated textures, I tend to parse them in diatonic terms. I think I think, I hear a G and a B, and I don't think of 4 semitones. I think of the 5th degree of the scale and the 7th degree of the scale. So I tend to parse things diatonically. I don't have absolute pitch, which is probably has something to do with it, because I locate things relative to the other pitches in the context. So I'll tend to parse things in diatonic terms. And the nice thing about doing computer music was that you're constantly working with real sound, and so your ear is the responsible organ, and you have to think of things in terms that are reasonable for what you're getting. And doing computer music was I was dealing with pitches, so I did I have a number of pieces which are not strictly tonal, and I never use key signatures, and I don't think of myself. I don't sort of orient myself with a major key or something like that. But I find myself working in those terms, working in terms that will orient pitches to a diatonic context. Talking about Milton Babbitt, it was very interesting. Milton had very good absolute pitch, and I think that has a lot to do with his view toward the 12-tone system, because he could parse things without much difficulty. I, on the other hand, as I said, think of things diatonically, and so that tends to inform most of my computer music. I have a number of pieces which use complicated harmonic scenarios. I have a piece called a piece for piano, several pieces that use different kinds of techniques, and it's interesting. But the whole issue, I people can think of me as a tonal composer, but I don't really think in those terms. It's more that I'm orienting myself to a diatonic framework, rather than thinking of myself as working in a key or some traditional form.
So I think we just for the sake of time, we'll keep going, and we do want to play a little excerpt of Threads. But before that, I just wanted to ask you, because one more aspect of your music, I love, and I mean, we all love your titles. And Matt and I played comic strips, for instance, and the title of the piece and the movements, titles are so picturesque and funny. And all of your pieces seems like the name is so right and so appropriate. So maybe could you tell maybe a little bit about Threads, how the name came about, or the process? Do you first think of a name, or do you first write the thing and then name it?
Well, Threads was an interesting experience. I decided to do something that was sort of contrary to what you'd think of for percussion music. Threads I actually thought of as having the format of a Bach cantata. So it starts out with something I call aria, and then I have a movement which is very lyrical and uses tuned pipes and 2 vibraphones and pitched instruments, and that's followed by a movement called recitative. And the recitative is more percussive and has, more. I think it's only percussion instruments. I might have some bells in there. And then there's a movement called chorus, which is sort of loud and bombastic. And I decided to do that, to have that sequence again. So there's aria 2, recitative 2, chorus 2, and aria 3, recitative 3, and chorus 3, and then there's a chorale movement. And in the chorale movement, I actually sort of harmonize a chorale, an original chorale that I made up. And so that was the structure of threads. I actually used that chorale in a number of pieces. I used it in comic strips, a piece called Holy Moly that uses that chorale. I used it in the last movement of Textures. That's the same chorale. And there's a brass arrangement of that chorale. So it's my signature chorale tune. But that was basically how that happened.
Great. Well, we're going to hear some of your chorale music later through Textures, but first we'll play a little clip of one of the chorus movements from Threads. So that was Matt is in that performance from a show that he did with the Yale Percussion Group.
I think I was. Is that the group that Svet Stoyanov played with?
This is a little bit later. This is from a live performance. Matt, do you want to talk about this particular show?
Yeah, so that show was, I think, about 3 years ago, and it was up in Clinton, Connecticut. It was kind of almost a run-out show that a lot of times Yale Percussion Group just plays at its home base there. But we were actually playing a concert series that was out in that area. But yeah, pretty recently, just a couple of years ago. Okay. So that was from the class that was me and Sam Young Kyung Lee, and Dmitry Nilov were all in that performance.
And Bob Van Size.
Yep, and Bob is the artistic director of the ensemble and leads that group in that school. And I think all of us here in the quartet too have been deeply impacted by Bob in some way.
He's amazing.
Yeah, well, in terms of you being responsible for bringing us together, I also have to give plenty of credit to Bob, who picked your piece Textures for the Yale Percussion Group concert in 2015. It was kind of an important year. That was Matt and I's first year in the program there, and Yale Percussion Group had been selected to do the Yale New York series, which is a annual series that brings one of the chamber groups or some project to Carnegie Hall. So we played Textures once in New Haven, and then we brought it to Weill. Oh yeah, that's where we met and got a chance to talk to you after finally after emailing back and forth about the piece, and it was great to finally connect with you there. Let's talk a little bit about how this kind of translates over to Textures. It was great to find out that there was even a piece that existed that was large scale, like Threads, that we had all played and listened to for so long. Can you talk a little bit about the impetus behind writing the piece and your approach to developing what it came to be?
Well, this was a commission from Svet Stoyanov's group, Hammer Clavier, which had Gwendolyn Deese in it, probably know her as Gwendolyn Burgett, and two pianists, one from Bowling Green. Is he still there?
No, so he actually left, and because his position opened up, I got the job.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Thomas Grant. Yeah, great guy.
But so it was Svet's idea, and it just seemed to me like an interesting thing to do, because the instrumental combination is very unusual, and the Bartok Sonata is the only thing that is sort of the towering piece in that genre. But I listened to some of the Bartok Sonata tonight. It's a wonderful piece, but it's not really a percussion piece. It's a piano piece with percussion accompaniment, and so it seemed to me like a challenge to write a piece for two percussion and two pianos. And my idea was basically to make the two pairs swap responsibility. So there are lots of ways in which the pianos are percussion instruments, and there are lots of ways in which percussion instruments are lyrical pitch-making instruments. So I have marimba and vibraphone and Glock. There is a Glock in the piece, isn't there?
Yes.
Yeah. The compositional problem turned out to be to make individual movements different from each other. So there's not really a logical sequence in the piece, except for the ending, which is sort of a chorale. But the sequence of movements is one that makes sets up differences between the movements, and I thought of each movement as an individual movement, and the main responsibility of the movement was to be different from the surrounding movements and to be identifiable. So it was a luxury to write an 8-movement piece where I could basically concentrate on each movement individually and didn't have to worry about the sequence. Basically, I was concerned about making them different from each other, and I was looking at the names that I thought of. I think I basically thought of the names after I wrote the piece, so I don't think I came up with the name for a movement and then decided to write the piece based on that. I could be wrong, but that's my basic memory. So it was great fun, and it was really a worthwhile experience. Hearing you guys play in Carnegie Hall was a life-changing experience. So.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, your words really gave us huge encouragement, and it's been great to have your continued relationship with you, and we got to play the piece again for your 75th birthday celebration at Princeton, and yeah, we're just really grateful that all those things aligned to be able to make that connection with you and play your music. But I will say the difference between the movements that you mentioned and not having kind of any theme tying it together necessarily like you did in Threads was really clear, and that became really a big part of our process as a group to figure out how we were going to take this music and really pull the most identity out of each movement. And that's still something that we have fun with as we continue to grow with the piece. But you mentioned something really nice about the way that percussion is used and the way that you use the pianos. For us, for me and Matt, I'll say it was really great to see this instrumentation using some more modern senses of percussion, both with the instrumentation and just what we're able to do. Usually when we're playing, Matt is hanging off, helping play coach for us and supplying his ears, because Bartok unfortunately only gave him a couple triangle notes and a couple moments of of nice snare drum and bass drum moments, but vibraphone and marimba playing is most of the stuff that we do, and it was great to be able to bring our skills on those instruments to this piece. But also, you use the piano in really percussive ways, so that was, I'll say, something that we worked on a lot as a group, hocketing and passing around these themes between the group. Movement 4, Slither, is still the one that we play every time we get into a hall first, because we have to find the tempo, we have to make sure that our hocketing is in place, and it's still a challenge that we have fun with. So I thought we'd play a little bit of that actually, so that people can hear your percussive writing and these trade-offs that that Larry and Yevgeny pulled off really well. Yeah, that's also one of our go-to things in master classes, to pass on the hocketing skill that we've worked on so much as a group, just from the demand on us for it to play that one movement of your piece.
Yeah, it must be tricky because you're constantly off the beat.
And I think it's another one of those things that, as percussionists, we kind of have done that type of texture a lot. But I remember working with the pianists on this the first time, and like, man, we had to drag them through. Like, no offense to you guys, no, I love you, but we had to like drag them through that on like how to align this thing. It's just not something pianists have to do.
Right, it's not something that we had to do on a regular basis. So it was an incredibly eye-opening experience for me. I'm sure for Yevs as well. To have to learn these kind of skills, because, you know, as you might know, pianists, we spend a lot of time alone. And we kind of have our own sense of what time is and what rhythm is. And so when we're put into a context where everything, you know, it has to be just right, you know, it's a different level of commitment to understanding what everyone else around you is doing.
And I think it was also a great way to start as a group, because that skill is so transparent and there's nowhere to hide, and every little thing is going to make or break the rest of the performance. It's lent itself to a lot of the rest of the repertoire that we play. So thank you for giving us that rhythmic boot camp to help us play all the other music that we usually play.
You do it very well.
Thanks. Well, it was great also, because I wasn't familiar with your piano writing before this piece, to hear the way that you use piano more traditionally, kind of in a lyrical sense. And some of the music in this and is just purely beautiful, and I've seen you kind of pull off this sense of nostalgia and this really touching, intimate music through, say, the middle movement of hop. Three moves from marimba, and this just does it in a whole different way by using the piano, as these guys are more used to playing it. So we're going to hear just a little bit of movement 8 so people can get a sense for what that sounds like. That movement is always so refreshing to get to in the performance. We've just played 25 minutes of music by that point, and we just get to relax and play this beautiful melody until the very end, I will say. And then a bunch of notes fly around, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot. You've been writing all this computer music, and you probably spent a ton of time putting the tape together just as much as you would be constructing a piece of acoustic music. But then the difference on the other side of that equation is the fact that the computer, once it has it, it can kind of spit it out anytime, anywhere, exactly as you intended it. And meanwhile, some of your music ends up sounding that, or should be sounding that easy, but ends up putting a lot of physical demand on the player. And I was wondering how much you think about that, especially, I guess, in terms of your percussion writing and how things lay out on the keyboard and what you're doing to us.
Well, I got to keep you busy. So I have to say, I don't, I think I'm pretty conscientious about writing for players. So if it's difficult, it's because I know you can do it. That's sort of your job. So I do my best.
You really find a sweet spot kind of in every piece that I've played by you, that it takes a lot of time to get a lot of this challenging music to the point where it sounds simple and easy and almost improvised. Some people ask us after concerts how much of that piece we were improvising, which always gives me a little laugh. But once you get there, it's always kind of at the peak of our ability to do whatever it is that you're asking. Like in textures, Matt and I are running around changing mallets all the time, and it's kind of as much as we can do while still playing chamber music and kind of keeping our wits about ourselves. So you strike a really nice balance with that stuff.
No, you do an amazing job.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, we thought there's another part of your music that I find really interesting that I wanted you to talk about, which is the use of pattern. And when you like to use patterns, and you like to use patterns that are of different lengths. So that what happens, right, is that there's a shorter pattern and a longer pattern, and then it gets continually recontextualized as it goes. And we have a nice example of this to play, but I'm curious if you could maybe just talk about how you think of pattern, and maybe I'm also curious if that comes from your electronic music as well, because there's so much looping of things in that. Could you talk about that in your acoustic music?
Yeah, patterns are actually a big part of my electronic music. I have a piece called Patterns, with patterns, possessive patterns, which consists of a male voice and a female voice sort of saying letters and numbers. Male voice says numbers, the female voice says letters, and it's I can't remember whether it's 5 4-bar phrases, 4 bars, 4 of them, or 5 bars. It's been a while since I wrote it, but check it out. It's called Pattern. I did a lot with patterns. The Idle Chatter pieces are all pattern-based pieces, and so I really like working with patterns. And it translated very nicely to acoustic music. It was sort of a natural in electronic music, and in pieces like threads and textures, patterns were sort of a natural part of the game plan.
Yeah, it keeps things really interesting for us as players too, compared to, say, the music of like Steve Reich, where we're trying to provide some ambiguity between feeling a music a certain way, say in 3/2 or 12/8, and trying to hear it both ways and trying to deliver it both ways. And with your music, it's often handling kind of more starkly different cycles, where we're trying to create a different kind of ambiguity to allow the listener to pick up on something that's in a completely other meter. And sometimes that's even happening between, for percussion and piano, between our two hands, which helps give another challenge. So, as I mentioned, the the beginning of movement 8 feels like a huge breath of fresh air. Partly that's because the end of movement 7 is one of the hardest moments to pull off this phenomenon. So what you'll hear in this little excerpt, as the piece winds down, Yevgeny is playing this pattern of 3 16th notes with one rest in there, da 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 da, and Matt is playing an ostinato in 7/8, doom da do da do do da, and I am playing on the wood blocks a pattern in, I want to say 17/16, which goes doom da 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 da, doom da 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 da, doom. And it makes for quite the interesting composite. So this is the end of movement 7 of Textures. Yeah, lots of time on the Yale percussion studio carpet, just playing back and forth and trying to complete those cycles. I had to play 14 of them, and Matt played 15 of them, and we would try to make it all the way through to be able to pull off that one little excerpt of the music. And but it's such a great moment. People always think that something's off until we end together and make it look like we know what we're doing. But it's such a great effect that happens all over the piece. What's that?
You do it very well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and there's more moments like that. There's more moments like that in the fifth movement where that's more polyrhythmic, and we're dealing with sixes and threes and fives even, which is another great moment. I love giving that sense of maybe something is awry, and then everything just snaps right back together. So a couple of those different techniques that keep it fresh with these different kind of cycles. Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the difference between your complex music and the simple music, and that juxtaposition, and how you kind of create this narrative of 30 minutes of music that never really gets tired?
Well, it makes me tired to think about it.
Well, I think we can all agree that the music kind of speaks for itself. So I think we're going to start wrapping up our session here. And before we go, we'd like to ask you if you have any advice that you'd like to give to young composers. And we have a lot of young composers who are listening. And if there's any advice in terms of composition or life in general.
I'm not a big one for giving fatherly advice. I would say my advice to my students was always to write music that you like. Don't write the music that you think your elders want to hear. Write the music that you want to hear, and that's sort of typical fatherly advice. Be true to yourself. I'd say these days I recommend that young composers get involved with performers and find groups like you and work with them. But these are these are interesting times. I subscribe to Spotify, and it's interesting to listen to some of the lists they make up. I think they have machines make up lists, but there are interesting things in the lists. There's some nice combinations, and I think people are writing a lot of good music today. I'm optimistic about the future. So it's thanks to players like you that that composers have a resource and have a reason to want to write. So I wish I had. Well, I can't. I was going to say I wish I had come across a group like you when I was in my 40s, but I had plenty to keep me busy. So.
Well, we're really grateful for the music that you did write for our ensemble. And I mean, I know we feel really lucky to have a piece that's so substantial, to have this 30 minutes of music by you for our ensemble. It's been incredible for us, and I think for listeners, just to have a piece other than the bar talk that fills that that sort of form. So it's been amazing, and we're so happy that you got to write that piece for this instrumentation. What are you working on right now? What sort of things are you composing now?
Well, I'm flirting with a piece for 2 vibraphones and string orchestra. So that's sort of on a low burner, and I'm working on a piece for bassoon and viola, and I have a piece for harp and guitar. So, but I find it very hard to work in these times. It's people suffering. It casts a pall over the whole enterprise. So I hope we can see an end to this reasonably soon. It's difficult.
Yeah, I think we all feel the same thing in our creative output a little bit. I always say that one of the silver linings in all of this, I think, is that this has pushed so many ensembles to do these sorts of live streams that we're doing right now, and I think this is going to be so amazing for future musicians, years from now, when they're playing music by Paul Lansky and they wonder, I wonder what Paul Lansky thinks about music or about this specific piece. And then now we have an 1.5-hour stream with Paul Lansky talking about his music. That would have never happened before this. And so while so much bad is going on, I do feel lucky that we can do this, and that you took the time to be able to chat with us about your music. And so thank you so much for that.
Well, it's very encouraging to have you out there. And it really warms my heart.
We really appreciate the kind words, yeah, and we can't wait to get back out there and keep playing this. But again, thank you so much for your generosity and time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope everyone got as much out of this as we did. And thank you all for tuning in. We will be back next week with composer Thomas Kochev on May 27th at the same time for episode 4 of IQ&A. But this concludes episode 3 with Paul Lansky. Thank you so much, and everyone have a good night.
Thanks, Ken.
It was a great pleasure. And I love you all.
We love you too, Paul.
Mm-hmm.